All right, AP Stats. Happy Monday to you. We are going to wrap up our notes today for Unit 11. Hopefully, give you some time to work on the homework as well on Schoology. Don't forget that there are 3 homework assignments due today by 4 p.m., which are the 3 homework assignments from last week. So make sure you're getting those submitted on Schoology. The homework assignment for this section of the notes we'll make due on block day this week. Just as some reminders, Tuesday, when I'll be back with you guys, we will do our review for this unit. And then block day of this week is our Unit 11 test. So please be sure you're getting all caught up and ready to go for that. And that way you're ready to rock and roll. So in this last section, putting it all together, we're going to talk about regression and correlation, how things are affected. We've already kind of been discussing this as we've been going along, so this is just kind of a more so wrapping things up unit. So does it matter which variable is x and which one's y? The answer there is kind of twofold. As far as does it matter for the equation, the answer there is yes. It most definitely makes a difference which variable is x and which one is y. But how about for the correlation? Does it matter which variable is x and which one's y for the correlation? The answer there is no. You will have the exact same correlation value r regardless of which variable you make x and y. So which of the following graphs would you think has the highest correlation? You might even draw a line of best fit in there just to kind of give yourself a gauge of kind of what would be going on. So you'd have a pretty traditional line of best fit for the first one. The second one would maybe look something kind of like this. This one would definitely be close to all these points, but definitely above because of this point up here. And then this one would be kind of the same way, probably coming up something kind of like this. So which of those would you think has the highest correlation? Well, it's actually kind of interesting. They actually all have an R value of 0.816. So the correlation for each of these is actually the exact same, although you're looking at 3 totally different graphs. What's even more interesting is that they actually all have the same equation for their least squares regression line, which is 3 plus 0.5x. This is actually a fairly famous example of correlation that was provided by a statistician who was kind of studying correlation and found that actually all 4 of these graphs had the exact same correlation despite them having very different graphs. So if you're wanting to do some extra research on it, it's kind of an interesting thing that they did to come up with those. All right, so next question. How do outliers affect the correlation, least squares regression line, and standard deviation of the residuals? And are all outliers influential? We'll kind of talk about that here. So first off, how do outliers affect the correlation? The correlation becomes weaker. So when we're talking about correlation, you're going to have a weaker correlation as you are looking at that. For the least squares regression line, do they affect the least squares regression line? The answer there is yes, they do. So your least squares regression line, it is affected by it. It can obviously affect the slope. It'll affect the y-intercept. How about the standard deviation of the residuals, S? That's going to be a much larger value if you do have outliers. What about all other influential points? Do those also have any sort of effect? And the answer there is also yes. There is an effect on correlation, least squares regression line, and S when you're talking about influential points. Looks like it's kind of giving me some issues here. Let me close out at OneNote real quick and reopen it. We'll see what's going on. Okay, try this again. Okay, we are back in business. Okay, so where we had just left off, I'll just kind of draw these lines back in here. So we had drawn in these least squares regression lines up here, which we actually found out were all the exact same. It was through y hat equals 3 plus 0.5x. We talked about the R value for all of them being 0.816 was kind of an interesting thing. And then down here we just finished talking about correlation being weaker if you do have any outliers or influential points. Least squares regression line was also affected. So least squares regression line is also affected by this. And then we talked about our S, our standard deviation of the residuals, was going to be a much larger value. We also were looking at, are all outliers influential? The answer there is most definitely yes. Okay, so we're only going to look at a couple examples today, and that's going to be it for our notes. So in this example, here's a scatter plot showing the cost in dollars and battery life in hours for a sample of netbooks, which are small laptop computers. What effect did the two netbooks that cost $500 have on the equation of your least squares regression line, your correlation, your standard deviation, the residuals, and R squared? And so the two that we're looking at are these two out here. Keep in mind if those were not in there, you'd probably have a regression line that would look something more like this. So as far as your slope, it should be positive, but because of those two values, it is currently negative. As far as your y-intercept, so your slope would increase, is kind of what that's saying, if we were to remove those two outliers. As far as your y-intercept, as you can tell, the y-intercept would definitely decrease in value based on that new line that we've drawn in there. S, your standard deviation of the residuals, obviously you're taking out two influential points, so S is going to be a smaller value, so it would decrease, and then R is going to definitely be much stronger, so it would increase in value, which would mean that R squared would also be larger as well. Kind of like what we were looking at on the quiz that we took last week, so very, very similar type stuff there. All right, the second example shows the relationship between the number of fouls and the number of points scored for NBA players in the 2010 to 2011 season. And so if you notice here, we definitely have a positive trend. So as far as describing the association, first thing that we probably want to talk about is the direction. And the direction here is definitely a positive direction. The second thing we'd probably talk about would be the form. I would say it's probably got a linear form, most likely. And then we need to also talk about the strength of the association. And I would say that it's a fairly moderate strength. I would say that you're not looking at a totally strong one. And then the last thing, any outliers or influential points. And I would say there's probably an outlier maybe out here at about 325-ish. Which again, even if not an outlier, definitely an influential point at the very least. So B, should NBA players commit more fouls if they want to score more points? Because obviously you can see that as the number of fouls increased, so did number of points. But here's the problem I have with that. So here's why I'm going to say no, is that while there is this positive association, there's also a lot more variability. And so because of that, there is a lot more variation for players with more fouls. I would say that you don't necessarily want to just start committing a whole lot more fouls. Because as you can see, while some players will score quite a bit more points with an increased number of fouls, there's also a lot of players who are not scoring as much with a greater number of fouls. So while there is a positive association, that variation in the long run is what I would say would probably steer me away from wanting to commit more fouls. So, all right, guys, that is it. That's all we've got for today. Homework is posted on Schoology with an answer key. Make sure that your 3 homework assignments, again, that are due today get submitted by 4 p.m. So if you need to take some time today in class to finish those up, feel free to do so. And then your last homework assignment for this unit will be due the same day as your test. I'll try to get review posted as well for you guys so you can work ahead on that as well if you'd like to. But just know that Tuesday is a day that we've got set aside to work on that review and then test on block day. All right, guys, I'll be back on Tuesday. See you then.